So imagine a country that it's the absolute geographic lottery.
Right.
I want you to picture a nation experiencing an economic explosion that is so massive and honestly so incredibly sudden that it literally breaks the standard macroeconomic charts.
Yeah, it just completely shatters the scale.
Exactly. We're talking about the kind of wealth generation that makes analysts, double check their spreadsheets because the line graph tracing the country's growth doesn't just trend upward, it goes completely vertical.
It's wild to see on paper.
Right. And you immediately think of a golden ticket, right? It's the ultimate geographic lottery win. The kind of event that supposedly guarantees prosperity, modern infrastructure, and, well, an elevated standard of living for everyone, forever.
That's the assumption, yeah.
But what happens when that golden ticket doesn't actually translate into everyday prosperity? Like, what happens when a country achieves an absolute economic miracle on paper, but the reality on the ground tells a much darker, much more complicated story?
Well, it's really the ultimate paradox of modern economic development.
Yeah.
I mean, we are so deeply conditioned to look at a booming gross domestic product and, equate that directly with a thriving, wealthy populace.
Right, we see high GDP and we just assume...
We assume gleaming schools, pristine hospitals, a thriving middle class. But a headline number, particularly in a resource-rich nation, can be this brilliant, blinding mirage.
A mirage.
Because the wealth might exist, right? But its location, its distribution, and its actual impact on human lives can remain, well, entirely disconnected from the people actually walking on the ground above that resource.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and I'm joined as always by a resident economic data expert. And today we are pulling the data from a massive, multi-decade, World Bank-backed study.
A heavy one.
It really is. It's looking at Equatorial Guinea's oil boom, spanning from 1960 all the way to 2024. And I gotta say, the source material we have in front of us is incredibly dense.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got extensive data series, complex macroeconomic indicators, detailed demographic and health surveys, and just incredibly intricate footnotes from multilateral organizations.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
There is. And the mission for this deep dive is to look past those vertical line graphs we mentioned and find the actual human story.
Because when you look at decades of this specific type of statistics, the trade balances, the demographic shifts, the maternal health indicators, you aren't just looking at math.
Right.
You're looking at the structural skeleton of a nation in rapid transition. You are watching a society attempt to absorb a literal financial shockwave. And reading between the lines of this data reveals the mechanics of how resource wealth can sometimes completely bypass the very infrastructure it's supposed to build.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So to get us started, I want you, the listener, to set a mental image for yourselves. Picture the clean, crisp cover page of this academic report.
Okay.
Right in the center, there are these geometric lines drawn in the colors of the Equatorial Guinean flag. So you've got green, white, red, and a blue triangle.
It's a really striking visual.
It is. It's a visual representation symbolizing a deep desire for diverse, multifaceted development. But to understand why that diversity is so incredibly difficult to achieve, we first have to understand the physical space, right? And the people living in it.
Geography is destiny, as they say.
Exactly. We need to look at the geography.
And the physical constraints of Equatorial Guinea are really the crucible for this entire economic experiment, because the total land area is quite small. It sits at just 28,050 square kilometers.
Just 28,050.
Right. And to put that into perspective for you, it's roughly the size of the U.S. state of Maryland or the country of Belgium.
Okay, so it's a highly compact nation.
Extremely compact.
Right.
And when you have a landmass that constrained, any rapid injection of wealth or sudden shift in population doesn't just cause a ripple, it causes a localized tsunami.
Wow.
And the demographic data we have from the UN World Population Prospects demonstrates this perfectly.
Yeah, the numbers in this stack are just wild because, when you have a small landmass, any rapid change in population is going to be felt intensely in every single neighborhood.
Precisely. If we look back to the 1960s, the population density was incredibly sparse. We're talking about just over 9 people per square kilometer.
9 people, so very spread out.
Yeah, it was a predominantly rural agrarian society.
Yeah.
But if we fast forward through the data to the 2020s, that density has absolutely skyrocketed to over 65 people per square kilometer.
Man, That is a massive multiplier in a relatively short time frame. And looking at the charts here, this isn't some gentle slope.
No, not at all. It's a profound structural shift. This isn't just a story of natural birth rates gradually increasing over time because of better baseline healthcare.
Right.
The data shows this massive, undeniable growth peak that kicked in right after the year 2000.
And what drove that?
The sheer economic magnetism of the country. When the offshore oil boom really started taking off, it created this gravitational pull that reorganized the entire spatial distribution of the population.
People just rushed in.
Exactly. Urbanization surged dramatically. By 2023, the population growth rate was hitting about 2.4%, and the urban centers just expanded at a breakneck pace.
Yeah, I'm looking at this metric right here. In fact, the largest city in the country ended up absorbing roughly 36.5% of the total population.
Over a third of the country in one city.
Let's translate that abstraction for a second.
Yeah.
Think about your own city's growing pains, right? Imagine you live in a quiet, relatively small town. Everyone has space, the roads are quiet, the local services handle the capacity just fine.
Sounds nice.
Right. But suddenly, your town is announced as the permanent host of a massive, never-ending music festival.
Oh, wow.
Not for a weekend, but forever. Almost overnight, the population multiplies. People flood in looking for work, for opportunity, for a piece of the action. The infrastructure, the roads, the water pipes, the power grid, the sewage treatment, the housing, everything has to adapt instantaneously.
And that's nearly impossible to do smoothly.
Right. The physical space and the society are fundamentally transformed in the blink of an eye. The pressure on local governance to manage that influx must be unimaginable.
Well, the pressure is really the key variable there. When over a third of the nation's population congregates in a single major urban center in a matter of a few decades, the strain on municipal services is immense.
I can't even imagine.
It requires a pace of urban planning, zoning, and infrastructure development that would challenge the most advanced, well-funded municipal governments in the world.
Yeah, you'd need new electrical substations, new water purification plants, new transit arteries.
Exactly. And this demographic rush, this intense urbanization, was entirely catalyzed by what we can really only describe as an economic miracle on paper.
Okay, let's talk about that miracle, because this is the core catalyst of the entire story we're looking at today. We are looking at the late 1990s and the early 2000s.
The boom years.
The boom years. This is an era marked by extreme gross domestic product growth due to the discovery and exploration of offshore oil. And I have to point out the most shocking number in this entire data stack.
I think I know which one you're going to say.
It's right here in the World Bank indicators.
Yeah.
The per capita GDP, so the total economic output of the country divided by the number of people living there, it reached an incredible mind-bending peak of approximately $22,642 in 2008.
Yeah, 22 grand. To really grasp the magnitude of that specific number, we have to look at the data visualization provided in the report.
Okay, paint a picture for us.
It features this area chart contrasting current and constant price GDP over several decades.
Yeah.
So when you trace the line from the 1980s and early 90s, it's relatively flat.
Just kind of bumping along at the bottom.
Right. It reflects a quiet agrarian economy. But the curve after oil is discovered and comes online. It isn't just an upward trend.
No.
It is a nearly vertical, steep, ascending curve. It visually resembles a rocket launch. The economic output multiplied by factors of 10 in an incredibly compressed window.
$22,642. I mean, for context, in 2008, that number placed them above many established industrialized nations.
Absolutely.
Now, if I am a government minister in 2008, or even just an outside observer looking at the $22,000 per capita figure, my immediate assumption is that utopia has arrived.
Naturally.
I'm assuming that every citizen suddenly has access to world-class healthcare, that the schools are fully funded palaces of learning, that poverty is essentially eradicated, because the money is clearly there. The math says the money is there.
Well, the math says the value was generated within the borders. But the assumption that GDP per capita reflects the actual lived experience of the average citizen is, honestly, the single biggest trap in macroeconomic analysis.
The biggest trap. Why?
Because that $22,000 figure is an average, and averages can hide extremes.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say you have a room of 10 people, and 9 of them have $0, but one person has $10 million.
Okay.
The average wealth in that room is $1 million per person, but 9 people are still entirely broke.
Man, Okay, so we need to look at how that wealth is actually structured.
Yeah.
Because I know you, listening to this, understand the basic difference between gross domestic product and gross national income.
Right, GDP versus GNI.
Just to recap quickly, GDP is what is produced inside the borders, and GNI is what actually stays in the pockets of the residents.
Mm,
But when we look at the charts in this report, the gap between the GDP and the GNI isn't just a minor accounting difference.
not at all.
It is an absolute chasm. Why is the divergence so astronomical here?
It comes down to the fundamental mechanics of how multinational oil extraction operates. Specifically, we're talking about production sharing contracts, or PSCs.
Okay, how do those work?
Well, when a developing nation discovers deep water, offshore oil, they rarely have the domestic capital, the highly specialized technology, or the engineering expertise to pull that oil out of the ocean floor themselves.
Right, I mean, a deep water rig costs what? Billions?
Billions of dollars to build and operate.
Okay.
Yes. So the government partners with multinational energy corporations.
The multinationals bring the rigs, the engineers, and the billions in upfront investment.
Correct. And in return, those corporations take a massive percentage of the extracted value to recover their costs and generate their own profits.
Which makes sense from a business standpoint.
It does. So when a barrel of oil is pumped, its full market value is added to Equatorial Guinea's GDP because it was extracted in their territory.
And that creates that vertical rocket launch chart.
Exactly. But a huge portion of the revenue from that barrel immediately leaves the country. It flows to corporate headquarters in Texas or London or Paris in the form of repatriated profits, dividends to foreign shareholders, and payments for foreign manufactured equipment.
Ah, I see.
And that outflow is subtracted when you calculate the gross national income.
Wow. And the report has a really stark visual for this dynamic. It's a dual-axis line chart, tracking both metrics over time. And the GDP line is soaring up high, touching the very top of the chart. But the GNI line is trailing significantly lower beneath it, just dragging along.
Yeah, the disconnect is visible.
And there is this bright red downward arrow on the chart marking a severe income contraction after 2014. What happened there?
The 2014 global oil price crash. That devastated their national income.
Because all their eggs were in that one basket.
Precisely. Because the economy was entirely tethered to the price of a single barrel, when the global market dropped, the national treasury felt it instantly. Furthermore, the researchers utilized the World Bank's Atlas method and purchasing power parity, or PPP, to adjust these numbers.
And PPP factors in the actual cost of living. Right.
Right. How much a loaf of bread or a month of rent actually costs locally? When you look at the GNI per capita adjusted for PPP in 2021 constant dollars, the metric has actually been steadily declining since 2010.
Wait, really? Let me make sure I'm fully wrapping my head around that.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
So despite the headline GDP looking like a lottery win for years, the actual purchasing power, the tangible amount of groceries, housing, and goods an average resident can afford to buy, has been shrinking for over a decade.
Yes, that is the defining structural challenge of a hyper-concentrated resource boom. It creates a powerful illusion of universal prosperity.
An illusion.
Because the money is absolutely real and it is being generated, but it is siloed. It is locked inside a highly capital-intensive, foreign-operated, export-driven sector that simply does not widely distribute its income to the general domestic workforce.
Man, and this brings up the danger of putting all your economic eggs in one basket, like we just said. The data on foreign trade in this report is alarming in its complete lack of diversification.
It really is.
We're looking at the commodity exports, which is overwhelmingly just oil and natural gas. Throughout the 2000s, this export engine was roaring. They were regularly exceeding $10 billion in commodity exports.
$10 billion flowing out into the global market.
Right. But the data shows how fragile that engine is. After 2016, that export value drastically contracted to under $5 billion.
It was literally cut in half.
Cut in half. And if your national budget is built on the assumption of $10 billion, a sudden drop to $5 billion is catastrophic.
Oh, it breaks everything.
I think of this like a freelancer who has exactly one incredibly wealthy client.
I love this analogy.
Let's say you're a graphic designer, right? And 99% of your income comes from one massive global tech company.
Right.
When that client pays their invoices on time and constantly asks for more work, your life is amazing. You are upgrading your apartment, you are buying expensive dinners, you feel incredibly secure.
You feel rich.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you have completely ignored building up any other clients. So the moment that mega client has a bad quarter, or decides to delay an invoice or cuts their budget, you are instantly facing eviction.
Yeah.
You have zero safety net, no backup income stream.
The freelancer analogy
Yeah.
perfectly captures the vulnerability. And the researchers actually plot this out on a scatter graph, mapping the country's current account balance against global oil prices.
And I'm guessing they match up perfectly.
The correlation is undeniable. The current account balance, which is essentially a nation's checking account with the rest of the world, tracking imports versus exports, is wildly unstable.
So when oil is up, they're good.
When oil prices are high, they have a massive surplus. When oil prices drop, the surplus vanishes instantly. Because they rely entirely on resource exports, their current account balance as a percentage of GDP fluctuates with a volatility you rarely ever see in diversified mature economies.
But taking the freelancer analogy a step further, it isn't just that you lose the big client. It's that while you were busy working day and night for that one mega client, your other skills deteriorated.
Right, you stopped updating your portfolio.
You forgot how to code, you lost touch with other industries. And in this report, that deterioration is quantified in the structural shifts of the domestic economy. The data notes that agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors that historically employ huge numbers of people and provide fundamental food security, they dropped to a microscopic 1% to 2% of the GDP during the oil boom.
Just 1 to 2%.
Yeah.
And that structural decay is often associated with the economic phenomenon known as Dutch disease.
Dutch disease, let's unpack that.
The mechanism of Dutch disease is fascinating and really destructive. When a country suddenly exports billions of dollars of oil, foreign currency floods into the domestic market.
Okay.
This massive influx artificially inflates the value of the local economy. Prices for local services go up, and wage expectations in the booming sector skyrocket.
So if I'm running a traditional farm, say exporting cocoa or coffee, suddenly my costs to operate go up, but the global price for my coffee hasn't changed at all.
Precisely. Your agricultural exports become entirely uncompetitive on the global market because the local economic baseline has been warped by the oil money.
Wow.
Furthermore, all the domestic capital, all the bank loans, all the government infrastructure focus,
Yeah.
it all shifts entirely to the oil sector.
Yeah, why would a bank loan money to a low-yield farm when they could finance a logistics company serving the oil rigs?
Exactly. The traditional economic pillars don't just naturally fade, they are actively crushed under the weight of the oil pillar. It is a classic case of rapid deindustrialization and agricultural decay.
So the farms just wither.
Yes. The data series shows that only very recently has the services sector begun to show a slight rebound, but the agricultural base was essentially decimated.
Okay, so let's synthesize the board here. We have a massive, highly volatile oil economy that is heavily extracted by foreign entities.
Right.
We have a rapidly shrinking traditional agricultural economy, and we have a population that is rapidly urbanized, flooding into the cities. We need to look much closer at that population because the demographic makeup of a country dictates its economic destiny.
It absolutely does. And the structural makeup of Equatorial Guinea's population presents a profound challenge. The sources provide a detailed population pyramid.
And a population pyramid is the graph that shows age distribution, right?
Yes, it visually shows the distribution of various age groups within a society. For Equatorial Guinea, this pyramid has an incredibly wide, heavy base.
Meaning a massive proportion of the population are babies and children.
Yes. Approximately 35.7% of the total population is between the ages of 0 and 14 years old.
Wait, 35.7%?
Over a third of the entire country is made up of young children. That is a staggering proportion. In economic terms, how do we interpret that? Like, is having a massive youth population a built-in future workforce, a demographic dividend waiting to mature, or is it an immediate crushing weight on the current economy?
Well, it has the potential to be a massive dividend, but currently it operates as a severe burden.
How so?
In demography, we quantify this using the youth dependency ratio. This metric calculates how many young dependents there are for every 100 working-age people.
Okay.
In this country, the data shows that every 100 working-age individuals must support roughly 75 young dependents.
So 100 workers are economically carrying 75 children on their backs.
Exactly. Now consider the physical and institutional infrastructure required to support that ratio. Imagine you're a city planner in one of these rapidly expanding urban centers.
Oh, man.
You have to build primary schools, pediatric hospitals, playgrounds, and youth centers fast enough to accommodate a population where more than a third of the people are children.
That's a massive capital drain just to keep up.
Right. Now, if you can successfully educate them, provide them with modern skills, and keep them healthy, in 20 years, you have a massive, vibrant, energetic workforce ready to drive a modern economy.
And that's the dividend.
That is the dividend. But if your institutions fail to provide adequate health and education, that generation remains dependent, unskilled, and structurally locked out of the modern economy. The dividend becomes a compounding crisis.
Which brings us to one of the most sobering sections of this entire report, the health paradox.
Yes.
Because if you have a GDP per capita that hit over $22,000, you would naturally expect the health outcomes of the population to be stellar.
You'd expect state-of-the-art clinics in every neighborhood.
Exactly. But the progress mapped in this data is seriously stunted.
The juxtaposition of massive macroeconomic growth and lagging human health indicators is the most glaring contradiction in the data.
Let's start with the baseline fertility.
Okay, so the data from the demographic and health surveys shows that fertility rates have steadily declined. They went from 5.65 children per woman in 1960 down to 4.0 in 2022.
Okay, so the curve is dropping, which makes sense as a country urbanizes.
It is, but a fertility rate of 4.0 is still quite high, which continues to drive that wide population base we just discussed.
But the mortality structure, the data showing what people are actually dying from, reveals a very grim reality that simply does not align with the profile of an oil-rich nation.
It does not. Despite the immense wealth generated over the last 2 decades, over 60% of deaths in the country are caused by communicable diseases, maternal health issues, and nutritional conditions.
Let me stop you there because we need to really unpack the gravity of that. Communicable diseases and nutritional conditions.
Right.
These are not inevitable age-related illnesses. These are largely preventable with modern medicine, clean drinking water, and basic sanitation grids.
Exactly. In high-income or even strong middle-income countries, the leading causes of death shift heavily toward non-communicable diseases, things like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, which are associated with longer lifespans.
Right, diseases of old age.
When over 60% of your mortality is still driven by infectious diseases, maternal complications, and malnutrition, it is a glaring indicator of institutional failure.
It's failing the basic test.
It indicates a systemic failure to translate that massive GDP into basic public health infrastructure. It means the wealth generated by the oil rigs didn't buy widespread preventative medicine for the rural areas, it didn't secure clean sanitation grids for those rapidly expanding urban centers, and it didn't guarantee nutritional security for the poorest families.
And the specific statistics on maternal and child health highlighted in the report are incredibly sobering.
They are.
The data looks closely at prenatal care coverage. In 2011, the coverage showed massive room for improvement. It was nowhere near universal. But even more recently, data from 2019 showed that an alarming 46.3% of women of childbearing age suffered from anemia.
Nearly half of the women.
46.3%.
This is where we have to connect the data points across different sectors of the economy. Remember a few minutes ago when we discussed the agricultural sector collapsing to 1 or 2% of the GDP due to Dutch disease?
Yeah, the withered farms.
That wasn't just an abstract economic shift. It was a localized nutritional disaster.
Because if you destroy your domestic farms to focus on oil, what do the people actually eat?
Exactly. When a country stops producing its own diverse agricultural goods, it is forced to rely heavily on food imports. Those imports are vulnerable to global price shocks, and they're often highly processed.
Or they just become too expensive.
Right. Or, conversely, the poorest populations default to the absolute cheapest, least nutritious local staples just for caloric survival. The high anemia rates, which indicate a severe lack of dietary iron and basic nutrients, they tie directly back to that agricultural decay.
Wow.
You have a booming multi-billion-dollar oil sector, but nearly half the women of childbearing age aren't getting enough iron to maintain basic physiological health.
It is the golden ticket paradox, fully realized. The money is there, but it isn't reaching the plate.
Yeah.
And if the health infrastructure is struggling under the weight of this demographic boom, we have to look at the schools. How is the education system handling this massive influx of youth? The researchers frame this under the concept of learning poverty.
Building a capable, skilled workforce for a post-oil future requires a robust, universally accessible education system. And the data here presents another fascinating, counterintuitive contradiction.
What's that?
The World Bank indicators show that at one point, the primary school gross enrollment rate actually exceeded 100%.
Okay, I saw that in the data tables, and I honestly thought it was a typo. How can an enrollment rate be over 100%? You physically cannot have more than all of the kids enrolled in school.
It sounds mathematically impossible, but it is a known demographic quirk in developing education systems. Gross enrollment includes students of any age who are enrolled in primary school, expressed as a percentage of the official primary school age population.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of how that happens on the ground.
Let's say a country builds a wave of new schools. Suddenly, you don't just have the 6-year-olds showing up for first grade.
Right.
You have 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds overage kids who missed school earlier because of poverty, lack of facilities, or geographic isolation, suddenly entering the system for the first time alongside the regular 6-year-olds.
Oh.
Because the numerator includes all these older children, but the denominator is strictly the population of 6 to 11-year-olds, the resulting percentage spikes over 100%.
So it just means a massive backlog of older kids are finally getting access to a classroom. It's actually a sign of sudden, rapid inclusion.
It shows a massive surge in access. But the net enrollment rate, which strictly counts only children of the official age group, remains much lower. And access is really only the very first step. The real systemic challenge is educational quality and student retention.
Well, the report does note some tangible investment in the system. The people-to-teacher ratio improved drastically. The data shows it was a chaotic 57 students to 1 teacher in the 1990s.
Imagine that.
Seriously, imagine trying to maintain order, let alone teach complex subjects, to 57 kids in one room. Recently, that ratio improved to a much more manageable 23 to 1. That is a real measurable improvement in the institutional capacity.
It is a vital investment. Bringing that ratio down means the government is hiring and deploying teachers.
Yeah.
However, the depth of what experts call learning poverty remains incredibly severe.
So the quality isn't there yet.
Right. Getting a child into a classroom with a teacher is great, but are they actually learning foundational skills? And more importantly, are they staying in the system?
What does the data say?
The data shows the primary school completion rate is staggeringly low. Out of all the students who start, only about 32.6% actually complete their primary education.
Only 32%.
The breakdown shows males have a slightly higher completion rate than females, though both figures are critically low. Furthermore, repetition rates, students failing to meet benchmarks and having to repeat a grade, are stubbornly high, consistently over 10%.
Think about that visually. Let's use a leaky pipeline analogy. Imagine you are pumping 100 kids into the start of this educational pipeline at first grade.
Okay.
But the pipe is just full of holes at every single grade level. The economic pressure of the outside world, the need to help on the family farm, the lack of money for school supplies, the sheer difficulty of learning while malnourished, it blows holes in the pipe.
Students just constantly leak out.
Exactly. By the time you reach the end of the primary school pipeline, only 32 out of those original 100 kids emerge with a basic diploma. Nearly 70% of the students leaked out into the informal economy before even finishing the most basic level of education.
And this leads to an urgent, compounding economic crisis down the line.
Yeah.
If nearly 70% of your population isn't even finishing primary school, how can they possibly participate in a modern 21st century knowledge economy?
They can't.
How do they read complex technical manuals? How do they interface with digital systems?
Which brings us to the most profound structural contradiction in the entire report. This is the absolute core of the crisis.
Yeah, this is the big one.
Let me set this up, because this blew my mind when I connected the data points from the different sections.
Right.
Okay, earlier, we noted that the agricultural sector accounts for an incredibly tiny 1 to 2% of the national GDP.
Yes. The monetary output is negligible.
It generates almost zero monetary value on a national macroeconomic scale. Yet, the labor market data shows that agriculture absorbs a massive 55.1% of the entire national labor force.
It is the ultimate high employment, low output contradiction.
I just need to sit with the gravity of that math. More than half of the working population of the entire country gets up every single day, goes to work in the fields, and collectively produces 1% of the economic value.
It represents a severe systemic lack of productivity, mechanization, and modernization.
How does that even happen?
Well, over half the population is engaged in what is essentially low-yield subsistence farming. They aren't operating modern commercial agribusinesses. The data specifically notes minimal fertilizer consumption. They aren't using tractors.
Yo.
They don't have access to advanced irrigation grids, and they aren't integrated into commercial supply chains.
So it's just raw manual labor.
Exactly. They are working incredibly hard physically just to survive and feed their immediate families, but their labor doesn't move the macroeconomic needle at all.
Okay, I'm putting myself in the shoes of one of those agricultural workers. If I know that all the money, all the billions of dollars flowing into the country are located in the offshore oil and gas sector, why am I staying in the fields?
It's a fair question.
Why aren't these workers transitioning en masse to the energy sector to get a piece of that wealth? If the economy is booming, why isn't the labor force shifting to the boom?
Because the bridge between those two economies is broken.
Okay.
And here is where we tie directly back to the education data.
The leaky pipeline.
Exactly. The offshore oil industry is highly capital-intensive, not labor-intensive. A billion-dollar deep-water drilling rig does not need 10,000 unskilled manual laborers to operate.
Right.
It needs a highly concentrated team of 200 highly specialized, highly educated petroleum engineers, geologists, fluid dynamicists, and complex systems technicians.
And you cannot become a fluid dynamicist if you leaked out of the education pipeline in the 3rd grade.
Precisely. With a 32.6% primary school completion rate, the vast majority of the local population is structurally locked out of the most lucrative sector of their own economy. They simply do not have the foundational educational scaffolding to acquire those highly technical jobs.
So what happens? The multinational oil companies come in, they assess the local labor pool, they realize the specialized engineering skills simply aren't there at the scale they need, and they just import foreign expatriate workers to run the rigs.
Yes. The high-paying technical jobs go to imported labor, and the profits go to foreign shareholders.
Then the local.
The local workforce is trapped. They're stranded in an inefficient, low-yield agricultural sector because the human capital required to cross over to the modern service or energy economy was never built.
Man. And the data points out a specific gender dynamic here, too. Female labor force participation has been slowly rising compared to men, hovering around 70% in relative terms.
Which is a positive trend on its face.
It is, but they are largely trapped in this exact same low-yield agricultural cycle. They are participating in the workforce, yes, but they are participating in the 1% GDP sector, not the booming wealth sector. They are working the fields while the capital flows overhead.
And while the human capital is struggling to transition, the physical environment of the country is also paying a severe toll for this rapid, single-pillar development.
Yeah, let's talk about the environment.
An economic boom of this magnitude, combined with intense urbanization, leaves a deep physical scar on the land.
The data on forest cover is presented in the report as a descending staircase pattern. In 1990, the country had 26,991 square kilometers of forest. By 2021, that had fallen to roughly 24,233 square kilometers.
That is a loss of over 2,700 square kilometers of forest. In a country that is only 28,050 square kilometers to begin with, that is nearly 10% of their total landmass being deforested in just 30 years.
10% of the country just gone. What's it driving that?
This deforestation is driven by the rapid, often unregulated urban expansion we discussed earlier, alongside unregulated logging and land clearance for immediate subsistence. But the environmental toll isn't just about the loss of trees.
No.
No, it's about the energy matrix and the carbon footprint.
Ah. Well, the report features a bubble chart that maps this out, showing a tight, undeniable coupling of greenhouse gas emissions with economic growth. As the GDP spikes upward during the boom years, the carbon emission intensity fluctuates wildly right alongside it.
Right.
Why are their domestic emissions so high? Because the nation's electricity production is overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels. Historically, the data shows that over 90% of their electricity comes from burning fossil fuels.
Consider the irony of that dynamic. They are extracting millions of barrels of oil and gas to sell to the global market, but they're also burning a massive amount of their own extracted fossil fuels just to keep the lights on in their rapidly growing cities.
And to power the infrastructure of the extraction itself.
Right. Exactly.
Let me get this straight. Instead of using the billions of dollars from the oil boom to build a state-of-the-art, diversified renewable energy grid like hydro, solar, or wind, they just burned the very product they are exporting.
Yes. They are powering the infrastructure of the oil boom with the product they are extracting, leaving a heavy ecological footprint and making their entire domestic power grid completely vulnerable to the same resource depletion that threatens their export economy.
So when the well runs dry.
When the oil runs out,
Mm.
not only does their revenue stop, but their ability to generate domestic electricity is immediately threatened. They haven't used the immense wealth of the boom to leapfrog into sustainable technology. They doubled down on carbon dependence.
Wow. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most critical variable in this entire analysis, the invisible architecture that dictates how all of this data interacts.
Governance and transparency.
Exactly. Now, it is important to note that as we look at this data, we are looking strictly at the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI. We aren't making political judgments or endorsing specific viewpoints. We're simply reading the math of how international bodies score the institutional framework of the country.
Right, it's strictly a data-driven look at institutional capacity. And the World Bank's WGI data utilizes a complex, comprehensive methodology. It gathers data from surveys, expert assessments, and institutional reports, often visualizing the results on a radar chart across 6 dimensions of governance.
And what are those dimensions?
They include metrics like regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, and voice and accountability.
And what does the radar chart for Equatorial Guinea actually look like?
Visually, the chart is highly contracted toward the center. Across these dimensions, Equatorial Guinea's percentile rank is consistently low.
How low are we talking?
For instance, in the dimension of government effectiveness, which measures the quality of public services, the quality of the civil service, the degree of its independence from political pressures, and the government's commitment to implementing policies, the country generally sits below the 10th percentile globally.
Below the 10th percentile, meaning that mathematically 90% of the countries tracked by the World Bank rank higher in basic government effectiveness.
According to this specific metric, yes. The data also looks closely at control of corruption, which measures the perception of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain, including both petty and grand forms of corruption.
And voice and accountability, too.
Right. Both of these metrics indicate deep systemic shortfalls in the institutional framework. Now, as analysts, we always have to look at the margins of error. The World Bank data includes 90% confidence intervals because measuring institutional effectiveness is inherently difficult and subjective.
Of course.
Those intervals do show some volatility and uncertainty in the exact rankings from year to year, but the overarching trend line remains firmly embedded in the lowest tier globally.
I want to use a metaphor here. Think of a country's governance as the institutional piping system.
Okay, back to the pipes.
You can have an absolute ocean of oil money flowing into the national reservoir at the top. The GDP numbers can look spectacular.
Like a rocket launch.
Right. But if the piping system of the government, the ministries, the civil service, the accountability mechanisms, the local agencies, if that piping is full of leaks, blockages, and inefficiencies, the water never actually reaches the fields.
The wealth never reaches the schools or the rural clinics.
Exactly. The institutional piping is the limiting factor for all national development. And this raises an incredibly urgent question. Look at the challenges we have mapped out today.
It's a steep hill to climb.
How can a country effectively transition its economy away from oil when the reserves inevitably deplete? How can it modernize a massive, inefficient agricultural sector that traps 55% of the workforce? How can it overhaul an education system facing nearly 70% dropout rates?
It's overwhelming.
How do you execute these incredibly complex, multi-decade national projects if the fundamental framework of governance and institutional effectiveness is mathematically ranked in the bottom tier?
It is the ultimate bottleneck. The financial capital is there, or at least it was during the peak boom years of the 2000s. But the institutional capacity to deploy that capital effectively, to turn cash into lasting human development, is missing.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today, analyzing decades of complex data. Let's pull this all together and synthesize the 3 main conclusions from this incredibly dense World Bank report.
Sounds good.
Number 1, the golden ticket was real, but it was highly localized. The discovery of offshore oil brought explosive, historic GDP growth. But when you look at the gross national income and purchasing power, the actual acquisition of wealth by the average citizen remains highly disconnected.
The money flowed in, but due to the mechanics of multinational extraction, a massive portion of it flowed right back out to foreign entities.
Number 2, the economy is suffering from a profound structural mismatch. A massive portion of the labor force, over 55%, is stranded in inefficient, low-yield agriculture.
They are locked out of the lucrative modern economy, heavily constrained by systemic issues in educational quality and staggeringly low primary school completion rates. The bridge to the modern economy is broken.
And number 3, the future carries severe structural risks. A lack of institutional governance capacity, combined with a heavy, unmitigated over-reliance on fossil fuels for both international exports and domestic power generation, threatens the nation's sustainable future.
The foundation they are building on is inherently temporary.
And why does all of this matter to you, listening to this deep dive? Why spend this time unpacking the macroeconomic data of a small nation?
Because it's a perfect case study.
Exactly, because this is a masterclass in reading reality. It proves why you can never, ever just look at a headline economic number. A booming GDP, a soaring stock market, a massive export surplus. These can be absolute mirages if you don't take the time to look at the structural, human foundations beneath them.
You have to look at the GNI, the demographics, the health data.
Whether you are analyzing a foreign country, a multinational corporation, or your own local municipality, you always have to ask the deeper questions. Who is actually getting the wealth? What is the mechanism of distribution? And what is happening to the schools, the hospitals, and the land?
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, looking at the broad sweep of economic history.
Okay, what is it?
Historically, nations typically develop in sequential stages. They go through an agricultural revolution, which creates food security, mechanizes farming, and frees up human labor. That labor then moves to the cities for an industrial revolution, building manufacturing skills and complex logistics. And finally, using that built-up wealth and education, they transition to a modern service and knowledge economy.
It's a ladder.
It's a ladder. Each of those previous steps acts as a crucible, building the human capital, the education, the technical skills, the robust institutions needed for the next step.
But Equatorial Guinea skipped the steps.
If a country entirely skips those foundational steps by winning the geographic lottery with a resource like oil, they jump straight to the end of the timeline financially. They get the billions of dollars without going through the process of building the human capital underneath it.
Wow.
So the provocative question is, can a country ever go backward to build the human capital it missed? When the oil inevitably runs out, what happens to a house that was essentially built from the roof down?
Built from the roof down. That is a haunting, perfectly accurate image. You know, we started this deep dive talking about a golden ticket and a quiet town suddenly hosting a never-ending music festival.
Yeah.
The festival brought millions of dollars, bright lights, and towering stages. But as the data clearly shows us, the music eventually stops, the stage lights burn out, and the oil wells run dry.
And then what?
And when the festival is finally over, the people who live there still need a town that actually functions. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Keep looking past the headlines, keep questioning the mechanisms behind the data, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.